These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. Black to move. What is the best move? Notice the kernel of a discovered attack for black, the bishop in front of the rook on the f-file. If the bishop moves, the rook attacks white's king. That makes this a case of discovered check, giving the bishop 2 moves to make trouble. It's a light squared bishop, so look for a good white piece on a light colored square that it could attack and find the queen. The bishop needs to attack it in one move and take it with the next. The answer thus is bishop takes at c2, again winning the queen either by bishop takes queen, or, if the queen moves to block the check, an important possibility to remember, with rook takes queen. White to move. What is the best move? Here the kernel is on the h-file. If the bishop moves, white's queen gives check and black's king has to move. What to do with the bishop? It travels on the dark squares, and the only black piece on a dark square is the queen, which the bishop can't reach in 2 moves. But wait, think more carefully about the first part of the attack, the part against the king. Where would the king go? Its only escape would be to g7. If white could attack that square with his bishop, the king would have no place to go. So bishop moves to f8 is mate, a case of discovered checkmate. The important lesson is that when you think of where you might move the unmasking piece, don't overlook pressure it can exert against squares, and especially against squares next to the enemy king. Black to move. What is the best move? Removing impediments to discovered checks. We have seen how to deal with obstacles that may stand in the way of a normal discovered attack, how to create good targets for each piece, and how to open blocked lines. The same methods come in handy when building discovered checks, so there is no need to rehearse them here in detail, but since their use here sometimes looks a little different, a few examples may be useful. First, discovered checks often have to be created by making a threat or sacrifice that brings the king within range of the stationary piece. And since an unmasking bishop can go after enemy pieces that sit on the same color squares where it travels, you sometimes have to force a target onto one of those squares. In the frame to the left, black has the kernel of a discovered attack on the g-file, the rook behind the bishop. If black unmasks the rook, it will attack the pawn at g2, adjacent to white's king, and if the king itself were on g2, would of course have a far more potent possibility, a discovered check. How to move the king? Look for other pieces black can use to check it, capture pieces next to it, or both. There is one option: queen takes at g2, check. White's only legal reply is king takes queen. Now that the king has been lured onto the g-file, all that remains is to find a good target for the unmasking piece, the bishop on g7. It travels on dark squares. White's queen is on a dark square. So bishop takes at e5, check. Takes a bishop, puts white's king in check, and wins back white's queen after black's next move. By the way, if you have studied the chapter on bishop forks, another idea for black should cry out for attention here as well: bishop takes bishop, check. Forking white's king and queen. What makes it especially interesting is that if white takes the bishop, black then appears to have mate, queen takes at g2, checkmate. With cover provided by the rook on g8. Indeed, black seems ready to mate soon, no matter how white replies to bishop takes bishop. But not quite, for the surprising actual result of black's bishop fork is that it permits white to mate. The point to notice is that when white replies to the fork with queen takes bishop on e5, he checks black's king and seizes the initiative. Black has to play rook moves to g7 to block the check. Then white plays rook moves to g3, this not only blocks black's mate threat against g2, but allows white to mate a moment later on g7 with queen takes rook. There is nothing black can do to stop it, his queen is too far out of position to help. The moral: you must be especially careful to observe whether any of your opponent's replies to your ideas will put you in check. It can ruin everything. White to move. What is the best move? White has the kernel of a discovery on the c-file, but it's not yet in working order. The rook on c1, if unmasked, has nothing but a protected rook as a target, and the unmasking bishop likewise is unable to threaten anything more valuable than itself. But with the kernel in place, think hard about what it would take to make it succeed. Try saying if only black's king were on the c-file, white would have a discovered check and could take black's loose bishop with 2 moves. So now think about ways to move the king by attacking it with other pieces. The only useful piece for the purpose is white's rook on d2. Can it give check? Yes, with rook moves to d7, check. Examine the move. Critically, it's a fork of black's king and his loose bishop. If black moves his king, he loses a piece. His only way to stop the check and also protect the bishop is by moving his rook onto the 7th rank, rook moves to c7. Now what checks would white have, and with what results? Rook takes rook, check. leading to king takes rook, and then aha, the king has been drawn onto the c-file. White unmasks a discovered check with bishop moves to f8, check. Winning the bishop on g8 after black's king moves. You could have seen all this as well by noticing that the bishop on g7 is loose and thus an important target. You look for forks that would attack it and find one in rook moves to d7, check. You imagine the reply rook moves to c7 from black. This invites an exchange of rooks on c7, put this together with the kernel of the discovery on the c-file and you are led back to the g7 bishop as a target, but this time as the target of a discovery rather than a fork. Please excuse the absence of the white king from g1. He's having a break. White to move. What is the best move? Here is a small study in how the threat of a discovery can influence other matters on the board. White has the makings of a discovered attack on the e-file. What could the rook on e1 attack if the bishop in front of it were moved? Just the pawn on e6. But notice that behind that pawn lies black's king. It's another if-only point. If only the pawn on e6 were gone, white would have a discovered check with bishop moves to a6, check. Winning the queen after black moves his king. This means that the black pawn on e6 in effect is pinned in place. White is free to play pawn from d4 moves to d5 if he wishes. If black captures with pawn from e6 takes at d5, white replies with his discovered check. So if he is alert, black will instead reply with a move like bishop moves to d6, preparing to castle, and allow white to play pawn from d5 takes at e6 next move, planning to respond with pawn from f7 takes at e6, but now black's position for castling is not quite so strong. Indeed, notice that black's position overall is rather poor. He is behind in development, too many pieces still on their original squares, and he has weak light-colored squares on his queen side, a6 and c6. They are weak in the sense that white can put pieces on them and black can't chase them away with pawns, made worse by the fact that black's light-colored bishop, which he might have used to protect those squares, is off the board, while white still is available. In any event, the general point of the study is just to see how the possibility of a discovered check in the background can influence other features of the game. The threat of it can paralyze those pieces that prevent its execution and so permit advances that would not otherwise be feasible. Here it ultimately causes black to end up with an isolated pawn and bad castling position. Black to move. What is the best move? The bishop and rook mate. Since we have been considering positions where a bishop unmasks check by a rook or queen, let's look at one especially important application in detail. The unmasking bishop need not always go hunting for an enemy piece to capture, it also may be able to move to a diagonal where it can contribute to checkmate. The key mating pattern we will examine is this: a rook attacks the enemy king along its file, with a bishop, A, providing protection for the rook, and often, B, helping to seal off the king's flight squares. Here we will look at some examples of how the pattern looks in practice. In the leftward position, black has the makings of a discovered check on the f-file. He can go looking for white pieces to take with his bishop, but the better plan is to move the bishop to a diagonal where it, too, can be brought to bear against white's king. Hence bishop moves to d3, check. Plus a case of double check where two of black's pieces attack white's king at the same time. In response to a double check, the only legal reply is to move the king. Here it must go to e1. Now comes the classic mate, rook moves to f1, checkmate. See how the rook makes the first rank and the f-file impossible places for the king to be, while the bishop on d3, A, protects the rook when it lands on f1 and, B, closes off the king's other possible flight square, e2. White to move. What is the best move? Where does white have the kernel of a discovered attack? On the g-file. You look for a target for the rook once it is unmasked and find none. If only the king could be drawn onto the g-file, you think, and so you look for ways to make it happen. What checks are available? Queen moves to g8, check. Black's only legal reply is king takes queen, moving his king onto the sensitive line. Now if white moves his bishop, he gives check with his rook, so the question is what move to make with the bishop. It had better be good, since white sacrificed his queen to get here. A combined attack against the king is indicated, bishop moves to e6, check. Plus checks the king with both bishop and rook. Black's only move is to retreat the king to h8. Now comes mate, rook moves to g8, checkmate. With the rook attacking the king and its only flight square, and getting cover from the bishop. Black to move. What is the best move? Black has the kernel of a discovered attack on the f-file. The potential target for his rook is white's rook on f1, which is protected, however, by the enemy king. Black's queen is trained on the rook already, so the solution is an exchange. Black plays queen takes rook, check. Requiring the reply king takes queen. Now the king is on the f-file, so when black moves his bishop he has a discovered check. But instead of looking for white pieces to attack with the bishop, Think first about ways to give check with it, i.e., double check and go for mate. Bishop moves to d3, check. Plus forces the king to move. This time it can go two ways, back to g1 or onto e1. Either way black executes the now familiar mate pattern with rook moves to f1, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? White has the kernel of a discovered attack on the d-file, where the bishop masks the rook. What prevents this from being an effective discovered attack, or indeed a discovered check? First, White's own queen blocks the rook's path up the file. Second, there is not yet a black target on the file. The solution to these problems becomes clear enough when they are viewed together. Use the queen to bring the king into range. Thus queen moves to d8, check. Forces king takes queen. Since White will have sacrificed his queen, he will be interested in mate. Can he get it? Bishop moves to g5, check. Plus gives check with both bishop and rook. Black must move his king. He can take it two places, back to e8 or to c7. If he plays king moves to e8, White follows with rook moves to d8, checkmate. Using our current pattern, if black plays king moves to c7, look for White's next check. He plays bishop moves to d8, checkmate. Using something like the reverse of the current pattern, the bishop attacks the king and cuts off the flight squares on its diagonal. The rook protects the bishop and cuts off the black king's remaining flight squares. White could have made a different second move. Of course, bishop moves to a5, check, giving the double check from the other side of the board. But it doesn't work. Black's king soon can escape to e6. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's queen is about to get taken by the rook on d4, so it would be natural to think about moving it to safety, but black can do better. Think about offense and notice the kernel of a discovery on the e-file. What target would the rook have if it were unmasked? It would be aimed at White's king, and the check could be made a double with bishop moves to b4 if only the white pawn on e3 weren't in the way. With the obstacle identified, be methodical in getting rid of it. Try capturing something the pawn protects. It guards the rook on d4, which black can take with queen takes rook. Now if White replies pawn from e3 takes queen, the e-file has been opened for the double check. Bishop moves to b4, check. Plus, White then has to move his king to d1, permitting black to execute the standard mate. Rook moves to e1, checkmate. Cutting off the king's flight squares on the first rank and on the e-file while the bishop protects the rook and cuts off d2. White to move. What is the best move? Now let us tilt the pattern we are studying on its side. White has the makings of a discovered attack on the h-file, where his bishop masks his queen. Naturally you experiment with moves that take the bishop out of the way and allow the queen to give check. But before getting too far into the bishop's possibilities, ask what the king would do once checked and whether the bishop might aid in the creation of a mating net. The king is stuck on the side of the board and so could only be moved to g7. The bishop might cut off this possibility with bishop moves to f8, check. So then what would black do? Since moving the king would be impossible, he would interpose his bishop on h5. This way if white plays queen takes bishop he loses the queen to pawn from g6 takes queen. Don't give up, though, always ask what checks would have become possible at the end of the sequence you are considering. Here the answer lies in white's d6 rook that also is trained on the same sector. Imagine 1. Bishop moves to f8, check. Bishop moves to h5, 2. Queen takes bishop, check. Pawn from g6 takes queen, and now notice that with the g6 pawn moved out of the way, white has a fresh check to offer, rook moves to h6 mate. The rook and bishop operate the same way here as they have in the previous examples, the only difference is that they do it on the side of the board rather than along the top or bottom. The keys to the position are, first, to be aggressive in imagining 2. Queen takes bishop, even though on its face it looks suicidal, and, second, to consider how your rook can get in on the act. Once your mind becomes focused on a pattern, such as the business here with queen and bishop, it is easy to forget how your other pieces might be able to rush in and assist once the board has changed a little. Many a sequence is salvaged and then made crushing by adding new, unexpected firepower after the pieces which first start the combination are spent. White to move. What is the best move? Other large threats by the stationary piece. The logic of the discovered check sometimes can arise in positions where the unmasked piece doesn't give check but makes a different threat, perhaps a threat of mate, or a threat against the queen that nevertheless is so powerful that it must be addressed. Meanwhile the mobile, unmasking piece remains free to make 2 attacking moves. In this first position, white's bishop and rook are in the natural position for a discovery. The rook is aimed at black's queen, a threat so powerful that unmasking the rook works much like a discovered check. White will get to make 2 unfettered moves with his bishop while black saves his queen. White doesn't quite have the same flexibility in attacking the queen that he would have with a discovered check, because unlike a king the queen sometimes can move out of harm's way and guard against whatever threat the mobile piece has made. But that doesn't spoil white's possibilities here. He looks for a 2-move attack he can launch with his light-squared bishop, and sees that black's rook is loose and lies on a light-colored square. Bishop moves to a6, thus attacks the rook on move 1 and wins it on move 2, unless black plays queen takes rook e1, preferring to lose a queen for a rook rather than losing a rook outright. Black to move. What is the best move? One way to start a tactical assessment is by just considering what each of your pieces can do. This includes an automatic glance not only at the diagonals where your bishops sit but also at their ranks and files to see if they contain allied pieces that might be able to deliver discovered attacks. Here black's bishop on d7 hides the rook on d8 with nothing otherwise blocking the rook's path to white's queen. The setup is perfect for a discovery, not quite a discovered check, but an attack based on the same model where the unmasked piece creates a distraction that the enemy must address while the unmasking piece is given 2 moves to inflict harm. So black looks for violent moves to make with his bishop and thus finds bishop takes knight. Since white will be confronted with a threat to his queen, he won't be able to recapture with pawn from e4 takes bishop. Black therefore will be able to withdraw his bishop to safety on his next move and will have gained a piece. White to move. What is the best move? Here's a variation on the current idea. Where does white have the kernel of a discovered attack? On the f file. The f7 bishop and f2 rook are separated more than is usual, but it's no less important to see their relationship. Having found the kernel, ask what the rook could do if the bishop were out of the way. It could attack black's rook on f8. That's something, but on inspection of black's king there is more. The king has no flight squares and not many guards, so if white could play rook takes rook it would be mate. This means that if the bishop vacates f7 it creates a discovered mating threat in rook takes rook that functions like a discovered check. Black will have no choice but to fend off the threat to his king from white's stationary piece, so white's bishop, the unmasking piece, will get a free second move. White thus plays bishop moves to d5, attacking the queen. Indeed, follow the possible resulting moves and you find that white need not be satisfied with the queen. Mate soon follows no matter what black does. If black plays queen takes bishop d5, for example, he might seem to have created a defense against mate. If white plays rook takes rook, check. Black can play queen moves to g8, blocking the check, yet then white mates with rook takes queen. If black instead tries to extinguish the mate threat by replying to bishop moves to d5 with rook takes rook f2, white can skip bishop takes queen and just go straight for black's king with queen moves to g8, checkmate. The queen gets cover from the bishop on d5. Black's best reply to bishop moves to d5, it hardly matters, is our pawn from d6 moves to f6, all this does is throw a blocker onto the f-file. White's rook plows through it and black soon runs out of stalling maneuvers. Black to move. What is the best move? The crucial square to focus on this time is g2. Black has a knight already attacking it, and his queen is aimed the same way. If he could get his queen onto g2, it would be mate. The queen's path to g2 is blocked by his bishop. He could try attacking g2 by first moving his queen to c6, but this gives white a move he can use to defend g2 with queen moves to g3. So focus instead on the g-file, where black has the kernel of a discovery. If the bishop were gone, the queen would threaten to mate, so black looks for mischief he might make with his bishop, or, better, some way it might help with the queen's landing on g2. He finds no checks or captures for the bishop but identifies a move that nevertheless is effective. Bishop moves to e3, which attacks the bishop on f2 and pins it to white's king. It also cuts off the path of the white queen along the third rank toward any possible defense of the g2 square. White is doomed. A. If he captures black's bishop with his own, his queen remains blocked, black mates with queen takes at g2. B. If white instead uses his queen to take black's bishop, he likewise is mated immediately by queen takes at g2. C. If white advances his g-pawn to g3, black plays queen takes at g3, check, and mates a move later. D. If white advances his g-pawn to g4, he effectively blocks the descent of black's queen down the g-file, but black plays queen moves to c6 and again mates soon on g2, for the third rank still is impassable to white's queen. White to move. What is the best move? This is a rich, difficult position that will reward some study time. Presumably you see that white has the kernel of a discovery on the f-file. You also see a natural way to execute it. One bishop moves to c7, attacking black's queen and also threatening to queen takes at f7, check. But you wonder how formidable the latter threat really is. Suppose black replies to 1. Bishop moves to c7 with 1. Black queen takes bishop, allowing white to carry out queen takes at f7. Now black's king is forced to h8 and then what? Your queen can do no more by itself from f7. The key move to c is 3. Rook moves to h4, a fresh mate threat. Rook takes at h7, checkmate, against black's king on its new square. Black has a move he can spend responding to it, but there is nothing he can do to avoid trouble. He can't get any of his pieces to h7 to defend the square. The most he can do is advance his h-pawn. The first possibility, 3. Black pawn from h7 moves to h6, doesn't help, it results in 4. Rook takes at h6, check. Bishop takes rook, 5. Queen moves to h7, checkmate. Black's second option, 3. Black pawn from h7 moves to h5, is a little better as it avoids mate. Play goes 4. Rook takes at h5, check. Pawn from g6 takes rook, 5. Queen takes at h5, check. Always looking for the next check, king moves to g8, 6. Queen moves to h7, check. King moves to f8, 7. Knight moves to e6, check. Forking black's king and queen. The net, white gives up a bishop and a rook to gain a queen, 3 pawns, and a better game. His offensive continues. There are various ways he might win still more material. Assuming you follow all this, it's worth a patient look. What does it prove? Just that if black replies to 1. Bishop moves to c7 by playing queen takes bishop, he gets hurt, so bishop moves to c7 does indeed give white a working discovered attack. But what will black do about it? Obviously he doesn't want to simply forfeit his queen. Does he have anything better? Ideally he would like a move that makes a good counter threat against white while also defending against mate. Black almost has such an option in 1. Black knight moves to e5, attacking white's queen and guarding f7. Of course it loses the piece to bishop takes knight, but it's still black's best reply. This position contains a couple of natural stuck points places in the analysis where it's easy to hit a wall. The first comes after c1. Bishop moves to c7, queen takes bishop, 2. Queen takes at f7, check. King moves to h8 and now it needs to occur to you to bring the rook over to h4, which is tricky to see for several reasons. A. Rook moves to h4 brings a piece into the action that had not initially appeared to be part of the plan. It's natural when you begin playing with a tactical idea to focus on the principal pieces involved here, white's queen, bishop and knight. But as we recently had occasion to note, many a sequence turns out to depend precisely on the clever addition of an unexpected piece or pawn to the attack. This is a key reason why developing your pieces, i.e., getting them off of their original squares, is important before launching an offensive. They all may have the potential to perform supporting roles. The repeating moral: think about all of your pieces and how they can help when planning a tactical sequence. B. Rook moves to h4 requires you to remember that the bishop now on f4 would be gone after the first move and that this would open a line for your rook to use to reach the h-file. This is a standard sort of cognitive challenge at the chessboard. The only cure is to be careful about it when you practice visualizing these sequences. Every time you make a move, think not only of the piece on its new square but also of its absence from the old one. C. Rook moves to h4 is not a forcing move in the strong sense associated with a check or capture, so it might not spring to mind as quickly as those other possibilities would. But it still requires a look because it creates a mate threat. It aims a piece at a square next to the enemy king that you already have under attack. It therefore forces black's reply. It makes him advance his h-pawn, which ends up having other consequences as well. Moves of your heavy pieces, your queen or rooks, to the h-file against the castled enemy king are common sources of good, forcing threats. A second natural stuck point comes after 3. Rook moves to h4, pawn from h7 moves to h5, 4. Rook takes at h5, pawn from g6 takes rook, 5. Queen takes at h5, king moves to g8, 6. Queen moves to h7, check. King moves to f8. At this point you need to c7. Knight moves to e6, check. The knight fork. You might overlook it by thinking in a rut. You have been trying to chase down black's king with your queen, now you have run out of ways to do it. The earlier point repeats: when your idea hits a wall, remember to ask afresh how your other pieces might help, and whether some new tactical idea might make an unexpected appearance. This is especially important when you have a knight in the vicinity and the enemy king is moving. The potential for a knight fork may pop up at any time during a sequence. And of course you have to remember as well that at this late stage of the sequence black's queen still sits on c7, where it went on black's first move. White to move. What is the best move? Horizontal discovered checks. Naturally, a discovered check can occur horizontally along a rank as well as vertically along a file. Here are a few examples of what the horizontal patterns look like. In the diagram on the left, white has the makings of a horizontal discovered check on the 8th rank. The black king is in place. The only question is what the bishop should do to take advantage of the check that will occur once it moves out of the rook's way. It could take black's knight, of course, with bishop moves to e7, check. But it would be a mistake to settle for so little. Consider first the king's response to the discovered check. Ask whether the unmasking piece might add to a mating net. In this case the king would be forced to move to g7. Can white's bishop attack that square when it unmasks the rook? Yes, one bishop moves to f6, checkmate. Is mate. White to move. What is the best move? Where does white have the kernel of a discovered attack? Not on any file, of course, but along the 6th rank. It isn't easy to see because at present the rook has no target once unmasked, but white would have a discovered check if black's king could be drawn onto h6. Experiment with any checks white can give using other pieces or pawns. Here pawn from h5 moves to h6, check. Checks the king. It also puts a pawn on the square where we want black's king to go, inviting a capture there. Black has two options, take the pawn or move the king to the back rank. If he goes the latter route, consider first what checks would be possible and you find rook moves to e8, which is checkmate. See how the pawn on h6 and the bishop on g6 together seal off all the king's flight squares on the 7th rank. So instead black will have to play one. Black king takes at h6. But now he has put his king on the same line with white's bishop and rook and has made it prey to a discovered check. White merely needs to find something good for his bishop to spend two moves doing, and he finds it in bishop moves to e8, check. After black moves his king out of check, white plays bishop takes rook, winning the rook. Realistically, the most likely way you would see the tactical idea here is to start by examining the pawn from h5 moves to h6 check as a matter of course, Then you see that after king takes at h6 you have a discovered check arranged, and that if the king instead retreats you have mate. White to move. What is the best move? Where does white have the makings of a discovered attack? On the third rank, where the bishop masks the queen. Well, in practice you probably would not think quite like that, since the queen so plainly has no target on its rank if the bishop moves out of the way. The real key to seeing what can be done here is to examine black's king and its vulnerabilities. It is stuck in the corner, white's bishop on b3 covers g8. And the file leading to the king is open. The king's lack of pawn cover and constricted movement cry out for an attack along the h-file. If white could get one of his heavy pieces, the queen or a rook, onto h3, it would be mate. Therein lies the winning idea, for white's queen already is aimed at h3. If the bishop moves out of the way, white's threat against that square thus is a mate threat, and requires a response from black just as a check would. So now all white needs is a dark squared target that his bishop can reach in 2 moves. The queen is the target of choice. Bishop takes at b6 wins it after black plays knight moves to f8, preparing to fend off the mating threat with his knight. White to move. What is the best move? The kernel of the discovery here should be obvious enough. White is poised to give check on the 7th rank by moving the bishop out of the rook's way. He needs a good target for the bishop. It's on a light square. What black pieces are on light squares? None. But that is no reason to give up. White's task is clear: get a black piece onto a light square, probably by forcing one of them to move there with a threat. Pawns are best for this purpose, since in the face of a pawn threat a piece usually must move. The threat can't be dealt with by just adding protection to the piece. A threat against a knight is especially useful here because every time a knight moves it switches to a different colored square. So pawn from b3 moves to b4 forces the knight to move, and wherever it goes it gets taken either right away by white's bishop or rook, or, if the knight moves to c6, by the discovered check bishop moves to d5, check. After black moves his king, bishop takes knight then takes the piece, which is defended by black's rook but also attacked a second time by white's rook. White to move. What is the best move? Two-steppers, building the kernel. The first step in our usual studies of the discovered attack has been to find the kernel of it and build from there. But what if the kernel doesn't yet exist? Then a bit more imagination is required. You need to experiment with moves here, moves by bishops and the pieces they can mask that create kernels. You learn to notice when a move or exchange you might make will bring the kernel of a discovery into existence. Here are some illustrations. In the case shown here, White sees that he has a rook on the open e-file. He has a bishop that can reach the same file with bishop moves to e7, masking the rook. Look at the position of the bishop and rook here, see how they thus are one move away from being in the classic formation for a discovery. The question is whether the move that creates the kernel also forces a target into place. Here the bishop's move to e7 would threaten black's rook on f8. Black's reply would be forced and thus easy to foresee, the rook would have to move to e8. This little sequence would create a working discovered attack, a masked piece, a masking piece, and a target all along the e-file. Now the bishop just needs a good place to go next. Bishop moves to b4 threatens black's queen, and if black replies queen takes bishop, white has rook takes rook, check. Followed by rook takes queen when black interposes his queen on f8. Notice how easy this position would be if it started with the kernel intact, i.e., with 1. Bishop moves to e7, rook moves to e8 already played. The challenge is just to think of white moving his bishop in front of his rook and to carefully consider the result. Black to move. What is the best move? Black faces the threat of mate with rook takes rook, so if he's going to take the offensive elsewhere he will need to work with checks that force white to play defense. The checks he can give with his queen takes at h2, queen moves to f1, or moves to the g-file don't quite work, but how about 1? Bishop takes at h2, check. White's only legal reply is 2. King moves to h1, retreating into the corner. But now the full kernel of a discovered check has been completed, black's queen is behind his bishop and aimed at white's king. This almost enables a mating sequence with 2. Bishop moves to g3, check. 3 king moves to g1, queen moves to h2, check. 3 king moves to f1, queen takes at f2, checkmate. That last move won't succeed here because of white's knight on d1, however, so black needs something else for his bishop to do as it clears the h-file and discovers check. It can't attack anything, it's on a dark square and all of white's pieces are all on light squares. But consider whether it usefully might block any lines. With 2. Bishop moves to e5, black severs the protection white's queen had provided to the rook on e8. Again white must move his king to g1, and now black plays rook takes rook. White to move. What is the best move? Start by examining every check. White has 2, rook moves to h8, which loses the rook without a good follow-up, and bishop moves to h7, which checks the king and, since the bishop is protected against capture, requires the king to retreat to h8. And now aha, we have the kernel of a discovered check. White's bishop masks the path of his rook toward black's king. So where should he move the bishop? It has no good black targets on light squares, but the more important possibility to consider is that the bishop might help finish black's king. The best piece to involve as a help toward that end is his queen. White would mate if it could be placed on h7, and what keeps it from being placed there is the presence of white's own bishop on the needed diagonal. So we remove the bishop from the line with 2. Bishop moves to g8, check. Black has to move his king out of check with king takes bishop or bishop moves to h6, either way, white has queen moves to h7, checkmate. The queen takes protection either from the rook on h1 or the bishop on g8, depending where black's king moved.